You're at a family gathering, and someone points to a kid across the room and says, "Oh, she's adopted." Like it's a footnote, a little asterisk on an otherwise normal family tree. It's treated as modern, progressive even. Something we figured out somewhere around the 20th century, alongside things like vaccines and seatbelts, except that's completely wrong. Adoption isn't a modern invention, it's not even close. Ancient humans were raising children who weren't biologically theirs tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote the word adoption down. So why would a group with barely enough food to survive choose to feed, raise, and protect a child that wasn't their own? The answer isn't sentimental. It's something far more calculated and far more human. Let's start with the evidence, because this isn't guesswork. In 2017, researchers examined a 10,000-year-old burial in Vietnam at a site called Man Bac, containing the remains of a young man with a severe congenital condition that would have left him paralyzed from a very young age. He couldn't have hunted, gathered, or contributed physical labor, and yet the skeletal evidence showed he lived into his 20s, meaning someone fed him, cleaned him, and cared for him daily, for years, with nothing to gain in the way we usually think about gain. That's not an isolated case either. A separate discovery in France, known as Ramito II, found the remains of a man with a form of dwarfism who lived alongside his community well into adulthood, fully integrated, buried with the same care as everyone else. So the ancient world wasn't some brutal, survival of the fittest free-for-all where anyone who couldn't pull their weight got left behind. Something else was going on. But here's where it gets strange, because caring for the vulnerable is one thing. Deliberately taking in a child who isn't yours is another thing entirely. Now here's the part nobody talks about. Adoption may have been less choice and more built-in insurance policy. Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes has spent decades studying the Hadza, a hunter-gatherer community in Tanzania, and one thing shows up constantly. Child rearing was never a solo two-parent operation. It was distributed. Grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, unrelated adults in the same camp. All of them fed, watched, and raised children collectively. Anthropologists call this cooperative breeding, and humans are one of the only great apes that do it this extensively. Here's why that matters. In a system where child rearing is already shared across a dozen adults, the line between my biological child and a child in my group gets blurry fast. If a child's parents died from disease, childbirth complications, or a hunting accident, that child didn't face a crisis of who takes me now. The system was already built to absorb them. Which raises an obvious question. In a world with barely enough calories to go around, wasn't an extra mouth to feed a genuine risk? But wait, what about the math? Surely a starving group couldn't afford charity. This is the part that trips people up, because it looks like altruism, but it functioned more like strategy. Evolutionary anthropologists point to something called kin selection combined with reciprocal altruism. Helping isn't just about direct genetic payoff. It's about building the kind of group where help flows back to you too, eventually from someone. A group that reliably absorbs orphaned or vulnerable children is a group that signals loudly, "We take care of our own." That reputation mattered. Groups with a reputation for abandoning the vulnerable had a much harder time forming alliances, trading partnerships, or marriage connections with neighboring groups. In other words, raising a child who wasn't biologically yours wasn't charity in the modern disconnected sense. It was social infrastructure. It made the whole group more stable, more trusted, and more likely to survive the next disaster, because someone would do the same for them. So if this was working out for the group as a whole, does that mean every ancient culture treated adopted children exactly the same as biological ones? Not quite. Here's the counterexample. Because adoption in the ancient world wasn't always warm and equal. In ancient Rome, adoption was an extremely deliberate legal institution, often used by wealthy families with no male heir to secure inheritance and political power. The Emperor Augustus himself was adopted by Julius Caesar, not out of sentiment but strategy, ensuring a chosen successor rather than leaving it to biology. That's adoption as political engineering, not emotional rescue. And it wasn't always equal treatment either. In some ancient legal codes, an adopted child's rights, inheritance share, or status could differ sharply from a biological child's, depending on the culture, the era, and the family's motives. Adoption existed everywhere. Love wasn't guaranteed everywhere. So the picture is messier than ancient humans were secretly wonderful to orphans. It's closer to this. Humans, as a species, built a system flexible enough to absorb vulnerable children when it served the group. And that system got used for everything from genuine care to cold political calculation. And that's really the part that connects everything here. A grandmother feeding a child that isn't hers is not weakness. It is strategy, older than agriculture. A group absorbing an orphaned child is not charity. It is a promise, made without words, that no one gets left behind because everyone might be next. A species that raises children collectively did not do it by accident. It did it because alone, none of us make it very far at all. That's the quiet engine underneath the whole story. Not sentiment for its own sake, survival, wearing sentiment's clothes. So what about the exceptions? The places where this system broke down. Not every ancient society absorbed vulnerable children so readily. In times of extreme famine or resource scarcity, historical and ethnographic records do show cases of infanticide or child abandonment, particularly when a group's survival margin collapsed entirely. The system wasn't infinite charity. It had limits shaped brutally by how much food was actually available. Cooperative breeding worked because it was usually sustainable. When it stopped being sustainable, the safety net could vanish fast, which is honestly the least surprising twist in this entire story. Compassion, then and now, tends to have a budget. So back to that family gathering and that offhand comment, oh, she's adopted. It's not a modern footnote at all. It's one of the oldest, most consistent threads running through human history. Older than farming, older than cities, older than most of the family structures we now consider traditional. A paralyzed young man in Vietnam, fed for 20 years by people who owed him nothing. A community in Tanzania, raising children as a shared responsibility long before anyone called it a village. A Roman emperor adopted into power because blood was never the only thing that made a family. We didn't invent adoption, we just started writing it down. We were never really strangers to each other's children.